Alright, y'all. We are back here looking at Chapter 3, Colonial Ways of Life. So let's go ahead and get started with it. Alright, so Colonial Ways of Life. So basically what we looked at was Chapter 1 was everything that's happening in America before the Europeans arriving, and then when the Europeans start arriving pretty regularly after Columbus. Okay? Then Chapter 2, we kind of set the stage for the development of the British colonies. What happens in those individual colonies, how each colony was established. Now, here in Chapter 3, what we're going to look at is basically what are the people doing? What are their ways of life? Kind of, I don't want to say so much of the cultural aspect, but a little bit of culture and understanding who and what and like the type of people that are here. What's going on? Again, the United States is going to kind of be born from, we're going to declare our independence from the British. So we need to look at what's happening in the British colonies moving forward to set the stage. Okay? So, let's take a look. Um, General notions, y'all. No matter what the reason, whether it was religious, economic, or physical loss, many people came to the new colonies. But with all of this variety, there are many similarities. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of different reasons and a lot of different people who come to the New World. Okay, and they all have their own different reasons. But when we look at it, there's some similarities among the people who do come. Okay, most were young, under the age of 25. Most people coming over were young, under the age of 25. Most of them were male. Okay, many of them were indentured servants. Most were middle society. They weren't rich, but they weren't poor. Okay, so we're going to see a lot of indentured servants coming over. We're going to see a lot of young people coming over. It's largely men who are coming over, and they are going to mostly be middle class. Not rich, but not super poor. Also, most Europeans had problems with the natives because of a difference in society. Okay? The Europeans brought livestock, and that quickly became a major problem. Could you imagine why that would be a problem? Like, why is it a problem that the Europeans are bringing over livestock? That they're bringing over cows and goats and all these different things? Yo, what would be the biggest problem if I came to campus and dropped 100 goats in the quad? The fact that they could go off and roam everywhere if there weren't fences, right? Yo, very rarely were these livestock uh, fenced in or pinned in into any region. They were just brought over and left to roam. Yo, that could get very bad when you start to think about what the damage that some of these animals can do and not controlling them or anything else like that. And you say, why didn't they fence them in? Yeah, I don't know if you know what it's like to build a fence, but it ain't easy and it ain't cheap. Okay, it can be very tough work. It can be very labor intensive work, especially when you talk about the time that they're working it. And y'all are like, well, a barbed wire fence isn't. Yo, barbed wire doesn't come around until like the 1800s. Okay, so what we're talking about here in the 16 and 1700s is a huge amount of animals coming over with no way of really keeping them in because very rarely did the Europeans take the time or have the resources to build a fence to keep them in. Okay, so it becomes a major problem if they're not pinned in or fenced in. Also, the natives were used to communal property in which they used practices that benefited many. They did not clear cut areas but used slash and burn techniques that left large trees in place. So again, y'all, Native Americans are very much going to look at things from a communal aspect. They're not going to come in and just wipe out every tree on this piece of property. They're going to cut away the smaller stuff, use slash and burn techniques, kind of take away the undergrowth so they could farm, but leave some of the bigger trees around for other reasons, right? And using this idea of communal property. Let this smaller tree grow up to a bigger tree to where it could be used later on for something more substantial, right? Whereas the Europeans come in, they just start cutting down all the trees in an area because they want to make a field to farm. So we see those things that happen, and a lot of times it's just a difference in the culture. The Europeans are looking at land as my land. This is mine. This is what I'm going to do. Whereas the natives were looking at it from much more of a perspective of a communal land. We all kind of share this area, so we all need to be responsible, and we're all going to kind of use and do things that everybody's okay with. Okay. Now we talk about population growth. Okay. Um, Coming to the New World was very harsh at first, but you could live a while. Like, you could have a pretty substantial life if you survived what they called seasoning. Seasoning was basically coming to the New World and surviving one year. Basically surviving an entire round of the seasons. We think about seasons as spring and fall and winter and summer and all that good stuff, right? But there's also the other seasons that we think of from a health standpoint, right? Like flu season or this season or that's allergy season. All those different things, y'all. You move to a new place and you stay there for a whole year. If you survive that year, your body has established a rapport with the ecological impacts that it'll be dealing with. And so it kind of becomes this idea of if you could survive some of those rough times in that one season or in that one year, okay, you would probably be okay. But that surviving that first year or so was typically very tough. Okay, once the colonies got rolling, many people came over, creating an influx of people that grew at quicker rates than the previous year. That's a fancy sentence, right? Creating an influx of people that grew at quicker rates than the previous year. What's that mean? Real simple. So, if I had 5 people, or let's say I have 10 people, right? I have 10 people, and they have children. So, they grow at a rate of 2 people per year. So, we got 10, then we got 12. Well, I bring another 10 people in, then the natural growth goes from 2 people to 4 people, right? Because now I got 20, and like it's that exponential, it keeps interest, right? It created an influx of people that kept growing exponentially basically every year. Now, when we look at birth rates and death rates, y'all, the early scarcity of women led to early marriages for both men and women. Since people married early, they had time for more children, increasing the birth ratio. Okay, so there's very few women who are coming over to colonies. So men are like, if I want a wife, I gotta get one early. I gotta get one soon. So men and women got married early. Well, because they're getting married earlier, they're gonna start to have children earlier as well. So that leads to this whole concept of people having more children, so that increases our birth rate. So the birth ratio is going up. Also, since the male and female ratio was so disparate earlier, because there's such a big difference between, there's so many more men than there are women, very few women remained unmarried and the birth rate stayed high. So very few women just didn't get married because you have so many men who are looking for wives, and they're going to go out and they're going to find wives no matter what. And because of society at this time, basically almost all of your women are getting married, so the birth rate is going to continue to stay high. The death rate was lower than the old world in New England. So in New England, the death rate is lower than the old world. But in the southern colonies, they had bad conditions, so they stayed high. Now, why would the birth rate go down in New England? Colder weather, right? Climate could impact that. So the death rate was lower in the old world, or was lower in New England than it was in the old world, but the southern colonies had bad conditions, so they stayed hot. Think about it. South is warm, swampy, a lot of muggy, and I know we don't think of, I know you don't think of Virginia as the South, like South Louisiana, but Virginia can have muggy, swampy areas that have a climate very similar to what we have here in Louisiana. So don't discount that. Rare famines and fewer diseases played a large role in lowering death rates. There's not as many people in the New World as there are back in Europe, so diseases won't spread. We don't have as many people, so there's not as many diseases to spread. Then also the fact that in America there's an abundance of food that Europe doesn't have at this point in time, so people aren't malnourished as much as they are back in Europe. So all of these people are ultimately going to be doing better. Also, the people in the New World in general were less susceptible to disease because they were younger. On average, or they were younger on average. The average age in the colonies, during this 1700 time frame, or at least throughout the 1600s, the average age was actually 16 years old. So we see a very young average age. So think about it. Who's more likely to get sick from just about anything? A person in their teens and 20s, or a person in their 60s and 70s and 80s, right? younger people are less susceptible to disease. Their immune systems are a little bit better. So we have young people coming over, and because they're young, they're going to be less susceptible to disease. They're getting married early, so they're having high birth rates, and then they're having low death rates because they're younger, and they have a better immune system, and the death rate is going to be low because they're not as susceptible to disease. Okay, so all of those things are kind of working in connection with one another. Okay, now we look at women in the colonies. Y'all, most women received the same treatment as in Europe. They were thought of as inferior and weaker vessels and forced into subservient roles, like being housewives. Many women accepted this, even though it meant they couldn't vote, make contracts, or own property. However, some left their mark on other parts of society, and many still managed to be respected as they often controlled business when husbands or fathers were away. So what we see is that these women in the colonies are going to be treated like women back in Europe. They were not seen as equal to men. They're going to be forced into lesser and subservient roles. They had very little legal standing, but some of them are still going to manage to be influential. Think about it. If a husband or a father goes off and leaves town or is away from home for a period of time, the wife or oldest child or whatever, those people they're in charge of the family business. So in essence, they can still be respected. They couldn't own property and do different things, but they could still gain respect and recognition as capable people. Okay? Now, the early shortage of women also gave them protection because some laws were passed to protect women and their rights. For instance, if a husband died, right? So if women couldn't own property, but a woman's husband dies, well, does she get the property, or does the property then go to her son, or does it go to, if she gets remarried, does the property become her second husband's? And if it becomes his property, what stops him from divorcing her, leaving her with no property, and now he's taken all of hers, right? So it becomes this weird thing. So we start to see some laws that were put in place to protect women, because there were so few of them. They wanted to make sure that women were not taken advantage of, and we can get into different ideas of what that means on a different level, but just on the face value, they recognize there's a scarcity of women, and they want to do what they can to protect those women. Okay. Now, when we talk about women within religion, there's differences between white women and black women in their roles in religion. When we talk about white women, white women in religion, we looked at it was very restricted. Their role was restricted, but they were heavily involved in religious practices. So what we see is that they couldn't do much. Like, women don't have a huge role in like a leadership role within their religion, at least not for white women. They couldn't do much except in Quaker churches. Remember, Quakers believed in a little bit more equality than the others, but they couldn't do much except in Quaker churches, but they were the majority of the congregation. It's always important to keep that in mind, as we look at what happens within religion. When we look what happens within religions, a lot of times women aren't in leadership roles, but they are often super powerful and super influential because they're the majority of the congregation. Think about it. Many of you, if you walk into any religious, any house of worship, right, throughout the country, you look around, there's a good chance you'll see more women than men. And with that in mind, it's this interesting idea that, how can I put it? You see where women don't have leadership roles, but they exert power, because if all the women say, no, we don't want to do that, well, then they're the majority of the congregation. They can dictate what happens. So anyway, then when we look at black women in power, women were not subordinate in many African cultures and many African tribes, and that followed them to the New World. So women in Africa were very powerful, had a lot of authority, and when they come over to America, or when they're brought over to America, that sticks with them a lot. So women were not subordinate; they were not lesser than men in a lot of African scenarios. So women were not subordinate in Africa, and that followed them. Many were seen within slave society as important to their religion. So it's important. So, that's just some general kind of concepts when we talk about what's happening in the New World. Now, or in the British colonies per se. Again, y'all, we're looking really at the British colonies right now. Now we're gonna break down the colonies into three groups. Okay, so we talked about all the different colonies the other day, right? From our New England colonies like uh, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Hampshire. We talked about some of the middle colonies like Pennsylvania, New York, that area. We also talked about our southern colonies, and our Chesapeake colonies like Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to break them down into those three groups: Southern and Chesapeake, Middle colonies, and New England colonies. Okay. So when we look at it like that, let's break down and look at them in groups because we see some similarities amongst those three groups. Okay. So, society and economy in Southern and Chesapeake colonies. So again, um, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay. So again, if we let me do this, um, it won't really do it. For go. So just kind of give you a concept here. Our southern and Chesapeake colonies, you got the Chesapeake Bay right in this region, right around here, right? So Maryland on down to Georgia, that's our southern and Chesapeake colonies. Our middle colonies are going to be Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, this region. And then our New England colonies are going to be Connecticut, um, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, all that stuff. Okay, so just kind of putting that in context for you, right? Okay, so the southern climate. Again, we look first at the southern and Chesapeake colonies. The southern climate allowed for the growth of new and exotic staple crops. Virginia had tobacco. South Carolina had rice. So crops that you're not gonna find pretty much almost anywhere in Europe, but here in the southern Chesapeake colonies, we can farm those crops. The southern woods also provided needed naval supplies like tar, pitch, and turpentine. Think along the ideas of like pine tar and different things like that. You need naval supplies. You need the wood for the boats, but you also need pine tar and pitch and turpentine, those sorts of things to seal the boats to make sure that the water doesn't leak into them. These things are going to be big in North Carolina. This is actually where North Carolina starts to get um, the the nickname Tar Heels. Y'all, if you're familiar at all with North Carolina, it's been in the news a little bit recently, but the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, they're known, their mascot, if you will, is the Tar Heels, and this is where it comes from. That, along with the influx of tobacco that was eventually grown in North Carolina. Point being, so this is the Southern Woods were big in North Carolina. We get the Tar Heel mascot from that. Now planters want large land plots so they can make a lot and still leave some land fallow or plant soil enriching crops because of the heavy drain that tobacco was. Now, when we look at that, understand this, y'all. To crops like tobacco that are really tough on the soil are really they want to have farmers ultimately want to have a big huge land plot, right? Like, by logic, if I make money off of selling my crop, the more crop I have, the more money I make, right? So these farmers want big huge plots of land. That way they can farm a lot of the land, and some of the land they could leave it empty, right? Why do they want to leave it empty? Because tobacco really drains the soil. And if you plant the same crop over and over and over again, eventually the soil is going to like run dry of nutrients and not produce a good crop. Or they either want to leave it empty, or they want to plant a soil enriching crop. We see some of that stuff even around here. The big crop around our area here at Nichols is going to be what? Sugarcane. But every once in a while you drive around, you see these plots of land that are soybean, right? Soybean, and there's a variety of reasons, the profitability of soybeans in certain markets, but also because it can help reinvigorate the soil after you've planted sugarcane in that soil for, 4 or 5, maybe 10 years. Give it a break, plant something different, plant some soybeans there, help regenerate the soil. Right? So because of that, they want huge land plots. Now, if you want to have a big farm, you need a lot of workers, and that's where we bring in indentured servitude. I know I talked a little bit about it with when we talk about Bacon's Rebellion, but let's look at it a little bit more here. Indentured servant, originally indentured servants were the labor pool for the planter society. So you get these planters, these people who come over and they're going to farm. They're going to own these big, huge farms. Well, they need workers. The first workers they look to are people that we would call indentured servants. So those indentured servants were the first group that really come over. Voluntary indentured servants made up about half of the white population in the colonies outside of New England. So what we're going to see is New England's not going to have a lot of indentured servants. Most of them are going to be in the middle and southern colonies. But when you pay attention to it, y'all, outside of New England, about half the white people in the colonies are going to be indentured servants. That's a huge number, okay? Now, they came over, an indentured servant came over and worked for an agreed upon term of years, generally in the range of 4 to 7 years. But not all of them came over voluntarily, okay? Many were forced because they were in debt, they were criminals, or even some were orphan children that had gotten older and they needed something to do, so they were shipped over here, okay? Now, the way it works is that basically, look, you're in debt to somebody in England, and I buy your debt from them. Like, I pay them off, so now you're in debt to me. So I bring you over and you work off your debt on my farm, and then you're off to go. Or maybe you were an orphan and you needed somewhere to go, so they ship you over, right? So not all of them came voluntarily, but some did. Now, once you were done with your servitude, once your time had run out, okay, the landowner was required to give you money, some tools, clothing, food, to kind of like get you started, get you set up. Now, indentured servitude eventually gave way to slavery because of the cost, okay? So pay attention to that. Go back when we talked about Bacon's Rebellion, right? What did we say? We said that those people who lived right on the border, you know what, y'all? I'm going to do this. I'm going to pull this back up. So what we said is that those people who lived right on the border, if I go ahead and that's the border, right? Well, you know what? I really don't like that. I really just don't like that. So let's just say that's the border. Well, what happens? We had the planter elite who lived right there, and then they brought in some indentured servants, and those indentured servants moved over here. Then more indentured servants came over, and they eventually settled out here, and then out here. And then we said, what? These people over here, that's where like Bacon was. That's where Nathaniel Bacon was. And he was fighting with the Native Americans. And the rich people over here aren't paying taxes, and yada, 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 and that whole thing. Well, what these rich planter elite that all stayed over here, what they learned from this indentured servant, from Bacon's Rebellion, was that if we keep bringing over servants, they're going to keep moving further and further and further and further out here. We don't want to do that. We want to bring in slaves that will stay here, stay on our farms forever. They will stay with us and it will be perpetual. And that's what eventually happens. So again, keep in mind that servitude is going to lead to slavery. It's this interesting thing because slavery becomes strictly for Africans and perpetual. Y'all, again, remember, slavery has existed in and around the world long before any European discovered the Americas, right? Y'all, slavery is not an American thing. It is a worldwide issue. It has a unique and distinct type in America. American slavery will become a very distinct type. However, it's not only an American issue. Okay, so that's what I'm getting at. Keep that in mind. Okay. Now, let me go back to this. African roots in black culture. While they spoke many languages and came from distant places, Africans shared some similarities. So y'all understand this. The Africans who are going to be brought over to the New World come from all different parts of Africa. They're not just one tribe or from one part. They come from all over Africa. And so they're very different. Just like the Europeans who came over are very different from one another. Africans are very different from one another. But again, they do have some things that are similar. So while they spoke many languages and came from distant places, Africans shared some similarities. For instance, societies were matrilineal, like women were the leaders of many African societies. It wasn't a male-dominated world as much as it was a female-dominated world. Okay. Many of the first Africans had layovers in the Caribbean or South and Central America. So many of the first Africans who came to North America didn't come straight from Africa to, say, Virginia. They came from Africa and went to Haiti or Dominican Republic or Mexico or Portugal, or they went, not Portugal, they went to Brazil, right? They went to places in the New World, then they went into the North American British colonies. Okay? Um, Africans worked side by side with white servants. So while we still have servants, while we still are using a lot of indentured servitude, what we see is that indentured servitude started, then people started to bring in African slaves, then eventually what happens is that indentured servitude fades out and African slavery becomes the dominant factor. But at first, Africans worked side by side with white servants. That would be drastically different than later generations. Okay. When we talk about slave culture, as Africans became African Americans, they assembled a new culture, one that had a distinct music, folklore, and religious practices. This culture was twofold. Okay, it helped slaves escape. Excuse me. It helped slaves escape from the problems of the day. Sorry. It helped slaves escape from the problems of the day and expressed in a hidden way their discontent with their enslavement. Okay, so understand this, y'all. Whether they're coming over and having that layover, and I know I just talked about that idea of the layover, but think about like when you're going back to that just for a second, y'all. Those layovers that I put there in the Caribbean. What we see is that a lot of times, think about it, if you're on a flight, right? You might fly from New Orleans to New York, but you have a layover in Atlanta first. Like you stop there first, stay there for a little bit, then you went on to New York. Well, that's what we saw happening with these slaves. So those slaves, or those enslaved people, are going to be brought over to the New World. A lot of times they're going to be brought over to where? They're going to be brought over to the Caribbean or maybe South or Central America. They're going to be there for a little while. Then they're brought into the New World. Or, excuse me, then they're brought into the British colonies, right? Well, what that means is that as Africans became African Americans, as we started to see people of African descent being born in America, we start to see all of these different cultures, the Caribbean culture, the African culture, the British slave culture, all of that kind of merging and melding into one. And that culture was twofold. Again, it helped slaves escape from the problems of the day, and it expressed in a hidden way their discontent with their enslavement. Y'all, think about what your culture does for you. Your culture gives you life, it gives you meaning, it gives you an escape. Y'all, think about what are things that we consider part of culture? Music, right? What can your music do? Whatever your music is, whatever your favorite type of music is, what does it do? It helps you escape from the problems of the day. You've had a bad day, you get in your car, and you crank up the radio and you drive home. Or you get into your dorm room, and you put on your headphones and you just kind of chill out, right? You just jam, right? So your culture is helping you escape from your problems of the day. But it also helped the slaves express in a hidden way their discontent with their enslavement. So what you see is different things like the idea of stories. Maybe you've heard of these stories of like Brer Rabbit or things that came out of local plantations like Laura Plantation right there on the Mississippi River right there in Vacherie, right? So you hear stories of like Brer Rabbit where you see these different stories, and what those stories do is they tell you of these certain characters who best these other characters. Well, when you realize that the characters who are often winning were representative of the slaves, and the characters who were losing were representative of the owners, and you realize that those stories came from the slaves themselves, it helps them express to one another in a kind of hidden way their discontent with slavery. Which, y'all, I always look at that as, how can we. I've always thought that, and this is kind of a funny way to put it, but it's kind of an art, right? To be able to insult someone and them not realize that they've been insulted, right? Well, when you look at some of these things, what the enslaved people are doing is they're sharing their discontent, their unhappiness with their enslavement in a way in which the enslavers don't understand and don't quite get. So it's a really unique concept there. Now, something else we need to pay attention to is equality for African women. enslaved women and enslaved men were on a little more equal footing. So when you talk about white women versus white men, there's a clear distinction, right? Like white men were here, white women were here. When you talk about slave men and enslaved men and enslaved women, and I will use those terms enslave or enslaved, enslaved meaning they were a slave, or enslaver meaning they were a slave owner, right? I'll use those terms. I'll use slave and enslaved pretty interchangeably. Same thing with slave owner or slave master and an enslaver. So just kind of pay attention to those things. But anyway, because enslaved women were field hands, because enslaved women worked in the field just like slave men did, they had more equal treatment with slave men than white women did with white men. So again, we have white men, white women. Then when we look at the enslaved ranks, enslaved men are higher, but the gap between enslaved men and enslaved women is not as great as the gap between white men and white women. Okay. Now, let's talk about religion. Sorry, let me pull that up. So religion. In 1642, Virginia's Governor Berkeley, that the guy from the whole Bacon's Rebellion thing, in 1642, Virginia's Governor Berkeley, made it an Anglican colony, a Church of England colony. Like that was the official religion. All other faiths were again persecuted and forced to leave. Soon, the rest of the southern colonies did the same thing. Okay, so Governor Berkeley makes Virginia an Anglican colony. And so after that, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all do the same thing. So if you're not an Anglican, you are going to be persecuted. It was not going to be a good place for you, and it was best that you probably leave that colony. Okay? Now, the society and economy in New England. Okay. First thing we're going to look up is townships, not headrights or plantations. So give me just a second. Okay, so society and economy in New England. What we see is that New England is really going to use townships. In New England, we don't really have big plantations or manors like in the South. So because of that, they're not really going to use the headright system. If you remember, we talked about this in chapter 2. The headright system was if you were able to get over here or you bought a share in the company, we'll give you 50 acres. If you bring servants, we'll give you 50 more, yada, 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 right? So in New England, there's not as much land. There's not as much farmland as we saw in the South, so they're not going to use that. What we see is they use townships, okay? So in New England, there's no headright system. They're going to use townships because of less usable land, less farmland, okay? They will grow things. They will still farm, but they will grow things like wheat and barley on a small scale. So yes, there is farming up in New England, but not nearly like there was in the South. More often, land was given to a group of people. This is what we call a township. More often, land was given to a group of people who created a township, and they subdivided the land amongst themselves. So instead of, hey, look, here you go. You came over, you brought some servants, whatever. Here, you got 100. You got 200 acres of land. You go off and use it. It was 200 acres of land was given to this group of people, and they divided it amongst themselves, ultimately, to create a town or a city. Okay. Then we look at enterprise and shipbuilding. Because there was a short growing season and a harsh climate, y'all think about it. Up in Maine, do you really think you're going to have a lot of like y'all in Maine, in Vermont, in Massachusetts right now, it's for us in August we're like, man, it's still like super hot. Up there in Maine, they're like, okay, yeah, we got to start getting things picked up before the snow comes, right? When we start looking at those things, because they had a harsh climate and a short growing season, they had very few cash crops. Most people went to the sea for their livelihood. They fished for cod and other types of fish, so they're really focused on fishing. Well, what do you need to do some of this fishing? You need a boat, okay? So it also meant they needed naval supplies and got involved in shipbuilding. They were big into shipbuilding because of all the old strong trees in the region. England, the mother country, when I talk about England, think about England as the mother country, right? England is going to be, in essence, the parent for a while to the British colonies until we declare our independence, until we go out, move out, and go out on our own. The British are the mother country, right? So they want this because it's cheaper to have the colonists build a boat than it is to cut down all the trees, ship all the lumber across the ocean, and then build a boat in England, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. You wouldn't cut down a tree in America, then like carry the tree on a boat all the way to England for them to make it a boat. You just make the boat in America, and then it could sail across with a whole bunch of stuff in it, right? So they were big into shipbuilding because of all the old strong trees in the region. England wanted this because it was cheaper to have the colonists make ships than send the material to England and make it there. Almost a third of all British ships at this time were made in the colonies because it sometimes took 2,000 trees just to make one large ship. So again, y'all, because we're talking about 2,000 trees sometimes to make one big boat, it could take a long time. It's a lot of effort, so it was cheaper to have the colonists make the ships. So ultimately, almost a third of all British ships were going to be, at this time, were going to be made in the colonies. Now we also see some other things that pop up. See New England witchcraft, y'all. Puritan society was going through many changes. Remember those Puritans who came up, John Winthrop, creating a city upon a hill. Puritan society was going through many changes. They came searching for a city upon a hill. But eventually, many members became less responsive to church doctrine, to church teachings, and more focused on commercial wealth. The decline of Puritanism reached a climax with the Salem witch trials. Now, we say, what's going on here, y'all? That commercial industry, that big time fishing industry, that big time boat making industry, y'all, making boats, that can be very lucrative. That can make you a lot of money. So we see the commercial industry in New England would grow quickly because of their shipbuilding. They became very cosmopolitan and materialistic region. Okay, so their commercial industry would grow quickly because of this, and they became a very cosmopolitan and materialistic region. So with that, Puritans go through many changes. They start fading away. Y'all, that last line on materialistic and cosmopolitan should have been before I started the witchcraft. But anyway, okay. So what we see is that they start becoming cosmopolitan, materialistic. They start backing away from the church. They start backing away from church teachings. They're focusing more on commercial wealth. Well, the decline of Puritanism reached a climax with the Salem witch trials. Y'all, the modern, like, there's Salem, Massachusetts, and there's Danvers, Massachusetts, where the Salem witch trials actually took place in Danvers. Think about it like this. It's kind of like the New Orleans airport that's really in Metairie, right? Like, it's named the New Orleans airport, but it's really not. The Salem witch trials, where they took place today, is now the town called Danvers. But point being, okay? The decline of Puritanism reached a climax with the Salem witch trials. Witchcraft is not new, but this was a really big incident. It left a lasting impact. It starts with a few teenage girls awed by the tales of a slave named Tituba. Tituba, I've heard her name pronounced a variety of ways. But anyway, it starts with a few teenage girls awed by the tales of this one enslaved woman named Tituba. Okay, the girls soon began acting strangely, shouting, barking at people, twitching, just acting very odd. The girls are diagnosed as bewitched, and they identify Tituba and two white women as the people who put a spell on them. Tituba confesses, and she says that other people are guilty of witchcraft as well. Y'all, well, this leads to mass hysteria. Think about it. If somebody in class gets accused of cheating, and they're like, yeah, I cheated, so did a bunch of other people. Well, then what's the teacher going to do? The teacher's going to be like, well, who else was cheating? Were you cheating? Were you cheating? And then when you stand up and say, no, they didn't cheat, what's the teacher going to tell you? Well, you're just sticking up for them because you probably cheated too, right? So we get this big snowball effect, y'all. So this leads to mass hysteria, and tons of people are arrested. Over 10 months, about 20 people are executed. One was even pressed to death. Y'all, it turns into such a big deal. Like, the people in Salem run out of room in the jail for everybody who's being involved. And we see 20 people are going to be executed in a span of 10 months. And y'all, that might not sound like a lot to you, but let's put that in context. In 10 months, 20 people were executed. I'm recording this video in 2020. You know how many years I have to go back for the state of Louisiana? Not just a city, but the state of Louisiana. To have executed 20 people, you have to go back to the year 1987. Like, if you add up every execution within the state of Louisiana, you will not reach the number of 20 until you get to the year 1987. They executed 20 people in 10 months. That's how hysterical this thing got. This is how big, this is how fast that thing grew. Y'all, again, about 20 people are dying. I think the number's actually 19, but keep numbers at round numbers, right? So about 20 people were executed. One was even pressed to death. What's that mean? Basically, they laid the one guy who was executed in all this, was pressed to death, and basically they laid him down and put a bunch of heavy stuff on him until he died, right? Like just put heavy things on him until he was basically crushed under the weight of everything, right? That's what we see happen. Okay, it's a really big moment. Okay? Now, let's talk about society and economy in the middle colonies. So we talked about the southern Chesapeake colonies, we talked about the New England colonies. Now let's look at the middle. What would you expect the middle to be? Kind of a mix. That's exactly what we're going to have. It was a blend of New England and the South. Okay. It had farmland like the South, but they grew New England crops like wheat and barley. They also had extensive commerce that would at times rival New England. Philadelphia also surpasses Boston as the largest city in the colonies over time. So they're an economic mix. They have southern land but northern crops. We see that they also get involved in business and trade. They had extensive commerce that would rival New England. Again, New England's going to be big in commerce. They have a bunch. New England's making boats, so they're going to do a lot of trading using those boats. Well, the middle colonies are going to start to challenge some of that. Again, Philadelphia is even going to pass Boston as the largest city in the colonies. Like the South, they use the headright system. Okay, so like the South, they're using headrights. They're not, because they have land like the South, they're using headrights. If they had land, New England is doing something different because they don't have that good farmland. Okay, and y'all, I'm gonna break this one up into two videos, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop this now. We will pick up with chapter 3, part 2 in just a bit.